It is March 1918, the Western Front. A British sentry stands watch in a forward trench. The morning fog is thick, clinging to the scarred landscape of no man's land like a wet shroud. For 3 years, the British have known exactly how a German attack begins. It follows a rigid script. First, a week-long artillery bombardment that shakes the teeth out of your skull. Then, whistles blow. Then, thousands of men climb out of their trenches and walk slowly across the field in long gray lines, making easy targets for the Vickers machine guns. But today, the script has changed. There is no week-long bombardment. There is only a short, violent hurricane of shells, a mixture of high explosives and gas that targets command centers and cuts phone lines. Then silence. The sentry peers into the fog. He sees nothing. He hears nothing but the ringing in his ears. Suddenly, a figure appears right in front of him. A soldier in a strange angular helmet, covered in mud, carrying bags of grenades over his shoulders. He doesn't look like the Germans the sentry has fought before. Before the British soldier can lift his rifle, he is dead. He isn't the only one. All along the line, phantom soldiers are dropping into the British trenches. They don't scream. They don't charge in waves. They move like water, flowing around strong points, attacking from the rear. They carry submachine guns that spray bullets like a hose. By the time the British officers realize they are under attack, their command posts are already destroyed from the inside. These are not ordinary infantrymen. These are the Sturmtruppen, the Stormtroopers, and they are about to nearly win the war for Germany in a single month. To understand why these men were so terrifying, we have to look back at the deadlock that broke the German army. By 1916, the war had become a meat grinder. The Battle of the Somme and Verdun had proven that the old ways of fighting were suicide. Sending waves of men against entrenched machine guns didn't result in victory. It resulted in mountains of corpses. Germany was bleeding dry. They were outnumbered and outgunned. The British naval blockade was strangling the country, cutting off food and rubber. The German High Command knew they could not win a long war of attrition. They needed a knockout blow. They needed a way to break the deadlock of the trenches, not with mass, but with skill. The solution didn't come from a general in a castle. It came from a captain in the mud. His name was Willie Rohr. Captain Rohr commanded an experimental detachment. He realized that the German army was too rigid. It was too slow. He proposed a radical idea. What if we stopped trying to capture the entire trench line? What if we created small elite squads of hunters? Rohr developed the concept of the Stormtruppen, the shock troop. His idea was to replace the rifle with the hand grenade. He reasoned that in a trench fight, you don't need to shoot accurately at 500 meters. You need to blast a corner at 5 meters. He stripped his men of their heavy packs. He gave them lighter boots. He armed them with sharpened shovels and bags of grenades. He taught them something forbidden in the Prussian army: initiative. In the regular army, a soldier waited for an officer to tell him when to shoot and when to move. Rohr taught his men to think for themselves. If an officer was killed, the sergeant took over. If the sergeant died, the private led the way. The mission was everything. The German High Command was initially skeptical, but then they saw the results. Rohr's unit cleared trenches with terrifying speed. They moved like ghosts. General Erich Ludendorff, the mastermind of the German war effort, saw the potential. He ordered the creation of Stormtrooper battalions across the entire army. The selection process was brutal. The candidates had to be young, fit, and ideally unmarried. They were pulled from the front lines and sent to special training camps in the rear. Here, they unlearned everything they knew about war. They trained with live ammunition. Casualties during training were expected and accepted. They practiced moving under artillery fire, timing their sprints to the rhythm of the explosions. They learned how to crawl through mud without making a sound. But what made them truly distinct was their gear. A stormtrooper looked different from any other soldier on the battlefield. They were the first modern soldiers. They reinforced the knees and elbows of their uniforms with leather patches because they spent most of their time crawling. They were issued the Sturmpanzer, a heavy steel plate that hooked onto their helmet to protect the forehead from snipers when peeking over a trench rim. It made them look like medieval knights, faceless and robotic. Their primary weapon was the hand grenade, the steel hand granite, the potato masher. They carried them in sandbags slung over their shoulders, sometimes 20 or 30 grenades per man. They were essentially human artillery. Their tactic was simple: sprint, throw a volley of grenades to suppress the enemy, and jump into the smoke before the dust settled. And then, in 1918, they received the ultimate weapon, the MP-18. As we discussed in our previous episodes, the MP-18 was the world's first submachine gun. In the hands of a stormtrooper, it was a trench broom. While the British were trying to cycle the bolts on their Lee Enfield rifles, a stormtrooper could spray 32 rounds in seconds. This volume of fire terrified the Allies. It sounded like a canvas ripping apart. Before the stormtroopers were unleashed on the British and French, they had a dress rehearsal, a test run to see if these tactics could actually break an army. The target was Italy. In October 1917, at the Battle of Caporetto, the Germans sent their new elite units to help their Austrian allies. The terrain was a nightmare: steep mountains, snow, and fortified Italian positions that seemed impossible to take. Among the stormtroopers was a young lieutenant who would later become the most famous German general of World War II. His name was Erwin Rommel. Long before he was the Desert Fox, Rommel was a stormtrooper, and at Caporetto he showed the world what these tactics could do. Rommel didn't attack the Italians head-on. He found a gap in their lines. Leading a small detachment of just 150 men, he infiltrated deep behind the Italian front. He climbed mountains in the freezing rain, bypassing enemy strongpoints. Suddenly, the Italians found Germans behind them. They panicked. They thought they were surrounded by a massive army. In 50 hours of non-stop movement, Rommel's small group captured 9,000 Italian prisoners and 80 artillery guns. He did it almost without firing a shot, simply by using speed, surprise, and confusion. The Battle of Caporetto was a catastrophe for Italy. The Italian army collapsed and retreated 90 miles. The experiment was a success. The stormtrooper tactics worked. Now, Ludendorff looked west. He looked at the British and French lines in France. He knew the Americans were coming. Millions of fresh doughboys were crossing the Atlantic. Germany was starving. The clock was ticking. He decided to gamble everything on one final massive roll of the dice. He would take the stormtroopers and throw them at the British in a massive offensive to end the war before the Americans arrived. It was codenamed Operation Michael. March 21, 1918. The Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's Battle. At 4:40 a.m., the sky over the Western Front exploded. 6,000 German guns opened fire at once. It was the heaviest bombardment in history up to that point. The noise was heard in London, but this was not the drum fire of the Somme. This was the Feuerwalze, the fire waltz. German artillery expert Colonel Georg Bruckmüller had perfected a new way of shelling. Instead of just destroying trenches, he mixed high explosives with gas. He used tear gas to force the British to put on their masks and then mixed in lethal phosgene gas. The tear gas irritated the eyes so much that soldiers would vomit inside their masks, forcing them to rip them off, and then the phosgene would kill them. It was a symphony of destruction targeting the nervous system of the British Army. Phone lines were cut. Command bunkers were buried. After 5 hours, the barrage moved forward, and out of the mist came the stormtroopers. Nature was on Germany's side that morning. A dense, heavy fog covered the battlefield. For the stormtroopers, this was perfect. They used the fog like a cloak of invisibility. The Allied defenders didn't see them coming until they were already inside the wire. The stormtroopers didn't stop to fight every enemy. This was the key to their tactic. If they encountered a British machine gun nest that was fighting back hard, they simply went around it. They ignored it. They kept running forward, deeper into enemy territory, targeting the artillery and the headquarters in the rear. They left the tough nuts for the regular infantry following behind to crack. The effect on the British was catastrophic. It was psychological warfare. Frontline units tried to call for help, only to find that the Germans were already behind them, cutting the wires. Officers looked out of their bunker periscopes and saw German helmets marching west, past them. Confusion reigned. Panic spread like a virus. "The Germans are everywhere," was the report coming from every sector. "We are cut off." The British Fifth Army essentially evaporated. In a war where gains were measured in yards, the Stormtroopers advanced 40 miles in a few days. They captured 1,000 guns and 90,000 prisoners. It seemed like a miracle. The deadlock was broken. The trenches were left behind. Open warfare had returned. Paris was within range of the massive German railway guns. The Kaiser declared a national holiday. School children in Berlin were given the day off to celebrate the victory. It looked like the Stormtroopers had won the war. But there was a fatal flaw in the plan. The Stormtroopers were victims of their own success. They moved too fast. They advanced so quickly, crossing cratered wastelands and destroyed bridges, that their supply wagons couldn't keep up. The German supply lines were pulled by starving horses, horses that were dropping dead from exhaustion and being eaten by the soldiers. The Stormtroopers ran out of ammo. They ran out of water, but most importantly, they ran out of food. Germany had been starving for years. The turnip winter of 1917 had reduced the population to eating fodder. The soldiers were malnourished, fighting on adrenaline and fear. When the Stormtroopers overran the British rear areas, they found something that stopped them in their tracks. They found the British supply depots. Inside, they found white bread. They found tins of corned beef. They found jam, cigarettes, and rum. They found boots made of real leather, not cardboard. For a German soldier who had been told that the British were starving too because of the U-boat blockade, this was a shock. They realized their leaders had lied to them. The enemy was not starving. The enemy was fat with supplies. Discipline broke down. Entire units of elite Stormtroopers stopped the advance, not because of enemy fire, but to loot the British pantries. Officers couldn't get them to move. Men sat in the mud, gorging themselves on beef and wine, drunk on victory and alcohol. The momentum was lost. The offensive bogged down in a sea of looted champagne and cheese. While the Germans feasted, the Allies regrouped. The British dug new lines. The French rushed reserves to the front. And now the Americans were arriving in force. General Pershing was pouring thousands of fresh troops into the line every day. These men were well-fed, eager, and armed with the shotguns we talked about in the last episode. The Stormtroopers were exhausted. They were the tip of the spear, and the tip had been blunted. The elite men, the bravest, the fittest, the most aggressive soldiers of Germany, had led every attack. They had taken the highest casualties. By the summer of 1918, the best men were dead or wounded. The replacements were young boys and old men who didn't have the training or the spirit of the original Stormtroopers. The German army had fought itself to death. On August 8, 1918, the Allies launched their counterattack at Amiens. This time, it was the Allies who used combined arms, hundreds of tanks, airplanes, and fresh infantry. The German army, hollowed out because its best men were buried in the mud of the spring offensive, collapsed. General Ludendorff called it the Black Day of the German Army. The Stormtroopers had pushed the door open, but they didn't have the strength to walk through it. But the legacy of the Stormtroopers didn't die in 1918. Though Germany lost the war, the Stormtrooper tactics changed warfare forever. They proved that a small group of well-trained, heavily armed experts is more dangerous than a mindless army of thousands. The concepts of fire and maneuver, infiltration, and squad-level independence became the blueprint for modern warfare. Every modern Special Forces unit today, from the U.S. Navy SEALs to the British SAS to the Spetsnaz, owes a debt to the tactics developed by Willie Rohr and his desperate men in the mud. Even the visual legacy remained. The distinct shape of the German Stahlhelm helmet, the stick grenades, the submachine guns, these became the symbols of the German soldier for the next 30 years. When Hitler rose to power, he would adopt the name Sturmabteilung, SA, for his paramilitary thugs, trying to steal the glory of the WW1 elites. But the original Stormtroopers were not politicians. They were soldiers who solved a tactical puzzle that had stumped the world. They were the ghost soldiers of the Kaiser. For one terrifying spring, they made the world hold its breath, and they showed us that in war, speed is the deadliest weapon of all. This has been Trench Tales. We have explored the weapons, the men, and the tactics of the Great War. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the elite forces of 1918, please subscribe and like the video. Tell us in the comments, do you think the Stormtroopers could have won the war if they hadn't run out of food? See you in the trenches.